Joining us now to discuss, Democratic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Senator, thanks for joining us, Mr. Chairman. Your colleague, Independent Senator Angus King of Maine, who caucuses with Democrats, he tells CNN that he wants to try again to reach a deal with Republicans on election reform legislation. Do you think that there is potentially common ground to be found on this, a more narrow bill, or do you think Democrats and Republicans are just too diametrically opposed on this?
Well, look, I hope that we can reach common ground. The preserving the right to vote and the ability to cast that vote is the very essence of representative democracy. Yet what we see across the country, over 400 actions taken by Republican legislatures in introducing bills that restrict the right to vote, that make it far more difficult to cast a vote, particularly in minority communities. That's a telltale sign of where Republicans really are at. So it is my hope that if it wasn't for the people, that then tell us what you're for at the end of the day, to see if we can come together on common ground, at least to advance some of the democracy gains that we should be having in our society, to make sure that everybody who is eligible to vote gets that right to vote and gets to do it relatively in an easy fashion.
Do you agree with the progressives who have said that Biden was not sufficiently vocal, not sufficiently out there campaigning on the issue of election reform?
No, I think the president has been, very forthright and engaged. The vice presidents have been very engaged. There's a reality. The reality is that we don't have 60 votes in the United States Senate. And for so long as the filibuster rule continues to be the rule in the history of the Senate, then we're going to have a challenge on some of these big things. But I will say it takes two to tango. So if I invite you to do things, whether it's on infrastructure or voting rights, and you basically say no, then it creates the impetus for some to consider what is necessary to be done to change the rules to permit maybe at least a democracy exception, because this is the very core of our government and how we proceed, and it affects all other things.
So you would support getting rid of the filibuster for an election reform bill exclusively, not just in general?
In the absence of any visible demonstration by Republicans to come to the table and broaden the scope of how we make the right to vote is enhanced, how do we get dark money out of our system, how do we ultimately have greater transparency in the funding of elections, I would consider that.
Speaking of working with Republicans, today Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts told CNN that she's frustrated with how much time Democrats have been spending trying to negotiate with Republicans on the matter of infrastructure. She says, time's up, time for Democrats to go at it alone. What do you think?
Well, I'm hearing that they're on the verge of a potential bipartisan breakthrough. I want to see what it looks like. I hope there is one. When I was in the House of Representatives before I came to the Senate, I used to sit in the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. It was always bipartisan. Our biggest challenges was urban versus suburban, rural versus, some other elements, how much for highway, how much for transit. Those were the big issues, but we always got infrastructure done. Now, we think of infrastructure far more broadly than roads, highways, and bridges. We think of it as broadband. We think about it in terms of innovation, research, and development in order to be able to compete in the world, especially against China. So we have a broader view. So I hope it's a robust bill, because we've been living off the investments of the greatest generation. We've done nothing to build on the greatest generation's investments that made us the infrastructure envy of the world. It's time to make a major transformational investment.
Speaking of China, I want to ask you about new comments from the Director of National Intelligence, who told Yahoo News that the U.S. may never truly know the origins of COVID-19. Quote, "We're hoping to find a smoking gun, but it's challenging to do that." She added, "It might happen, but it might not," unquote. Do you think that's possible? What happens if you cannot find out what really happened?
Well, it is my hope that we can and that we will, and we have to put all our resources to do that. For example, legislation that I have with Susan Collins that is bicameral and bipartisan for a National Coronavirus Commission Act that creates a 9/11 type independent commission. One of the charges would be to determine the origins of COVID 19. And so I think that's something that we all want to see. We want to understand it, whether it was by design or by accident or by wet markets. However it came about, we need to know so that we can prevent in the future and we can hold those responsible if there was actions that ultimately should have been brought to the world and its attention so that less people could have died. We owe it to the 600,000 Americans who have lost their lives, and we owe it to their families and their survivors.
Democratic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, thanks so much to you, sir. Appreciate it.